This is the story of the new Buick rear axle, new in design and new in service procedures. Become familiar with it, and you'll find this new axle is simple, rugged, and easy to service. Since it is completely new, it is not interchangeable with assemblies used in previous models. In discussing this new axle, we will describe the new features and then cover service procedures for removal, disassembly, cleaning and inspection, assembly and adjustments and installation. First, let's look at the new features. Notice the new torque tube mounting on the differential carrier. Its location, in line with the rear pinion bearing, has overcome the tendency of the carrier housing to flex under power and bind or overload the pinion bearings. Now let's look at the floating propeller shaft, which is free to move fore and aft. Due to the barrel design of the splines, the propeller shaft isn't locked rigidly to the pinion as in previous models. This provides a slight universal joint action at the pinion shaft. The torque ball has had a facelifting too. A rubber ring has been bonded to both inner and outer surfaces of the ball, preventing metal-to-metal contact. Variations in torque tube angle are absorbed by internal flexing of the rubber so that no frictional surfaces are present. The rubber ring also provides an effective seal, which eliminates the need for the former torque ball boot. Notice in this cutaway view how the carrier assembly has been redesigned. Pinion bearings now are of the tapered roller type. They are preloaded by varying the spacer thickness. Correct pinion depth is established by varying the shim thickness between rear bearing and pinion gear. Finally, the ring gear and case are supported by newly designed differential bearings and bearing supports between two pedestals. Ring gear backlash and differential bearing preload are both controlled by means of selective shims. Along with this newly designed axle, new special tools have also been developed to assist in service operations. We will show these tools in use as we continue our discussion. Standard diagnosis procedures with which you are familiar should be used to determine whether the noise originates in tires, road surface, wheel bearings, engine, transmission, or the rear axle assembly. Adjustment or replacement of parts in the rear axle obviously will not correct noises originating in other parts of the car. If and when the suspected trouble has been pinpointed directly to the rear axle, further road testing, as outlined in your Buick shop manual under rear axle noises, will help to determine if rear wheel bearings, pinion or side bearings, or ring gear and pinion are worn or improperly adjusted. In practice, replace or adjust only those parts found to be defective. However, we will discuss complete rear axle overhaul for the purposes of instruction. The rear axle assembly must be removed as a unit for servicing the carrier as follows. First, with the weight of the axle supported, disconnect the rear springs, shock absorbers, radius rod, and the brake connections. Cover the open brake lines with tape to prevent dirt from entering the system. Next, loosen the torque ball retaining bolts so that ball is free. Then replace two torque tube flange bolts with 3-inch guide pins. These pins will prevent damage to the torque ball housing oil seal when removing or replacing the propeller shaft. Finally, take out the remaining torque tube flange bolts, lower the rear axle assembly, and carefully roll it out from under the car. Position the axle assembly on suitable floor stands and remove the wheels. The unit is now ready for disassembly. With brake drums removed, unscrew the nuts holding wheel bearing retainer plates to the axle housing. An access hole through the axle flange has been provided. Note that axle side thrust is now taken by the wheel bearings, making it possible to remove axle shafts and bearings without disassembling the carrier. Using the slide hammer with axle shaft puller, pull axle shafts and bearings from the housing. Reinstall one nut to keep the brake backing plate positioned during the remainder of the job. If wheel bearing replacement is necessary, first partially split the retainer ring in 3 or 4 places as shown and remove it. Then, using the ram and yoke assembly together with adapter and plate, pull the axle shaft out of the bearing. Next, disconnect the torque tube brake line at the T-fitting located on the axle housing. Now disconnect the strut rods from the torque tube bracket, fastening them loosely together with the same nut and bolt as was removed. This keeps the rubber bushings and washers together as an assembly. Be careful not to bend the strut rods. Next, after removing the 6 bolts that fasten torque tube to carrier housing, remove the torque tube and propeller shaft together. Remove the brake line from rear of the axle housing and place the rear axle assembly in an upright position as shown. Install differential carrier sling. After removing the 8 nuts which retain the carrier assembly to the axle housing, carefully clean this area with a wire brush. Using a suitable method to support the sling, carefully lift the carrier assembly out of the axle housing as shown at the left. To overcome the tight fit of axle housing studs, drive down on the housing with a heavy brass or lead hammer while lifting the carrier assembly out. Then mount the assembly in the differential holding fixture as shown on the right. In the 70 series car, a vane-type oil pump driven by splines on the right axle shaft has been provided to supply lubricant directly to the drive side of the pinion gear. Remove the pump at this time. At this point, check and record ring gear and pinion backlash using a dial indicator as shown. If backlash is incorrect, this check will help to determine whether replacement of the gears is necessary. Also, the check will aid in reassembly if the old gears are to be used again. Next, remove the pedestal clamp bolts and pull out the differential bearing supports using the slide hammer attached to the differential bearing support puller. Now, with the differential bearing pedestal spreader installed as shown, spread pedestals only enough to allow the differential case to be lifted out. Be sure to keep the differential bearings and shims together and marked so that they may be reinstalled in their original positions. After the spreader has been removed, take out the oil supply line. The pinion depth setting gauge should be used at this point to check and record pinion depth in the event that ring gear and pinion are to be reinstalled. Place the carrier assembly in position shown. Use pinion spline socket and pinion spline socket handle to turn the pinion shaft clockwise out of the pinion lock nut. Pinion nut holder is used to hold the nut. Hold one hand under the pinion to catch it as it falls out of the housing. Next, pry out pinion oil seal from the carrier housing, being careful not to damage the front pinion bearing. Then remove front bearing and drive out the outer race using the driver handle and front pinion bearing outer race remover. If old bearings are to be reused, always leave the outer races in place. Invert the carrier in the differential holding fixture. Use the driver handle with race remover to drive out the rear pinion bearing outer race. Carefully engage the rear pinion bearing remover with the rollers of the bearing. Then press the pinion shaft out of the bearing by means of the ram and yoke assembly and the press plate holder. Now let's turn our attention to the ring gear and case. Make alignment marks on each so that if necessary they may be assembled in the same position. Then remove retaining bolts and tap off the ring gear. Remove the spring lock pin and the side pinion shaft and shield from the case. Next, remove the pinions, side pinion thrust washers and side gears. Mark all parts so they can be replaced in their original positions if found satisfactory. Finally, take out the differential bearing outer races using differential bearing outer race remover. This completes the disassembly. Now for cleaning and inspection. Wash all the disassembled parts in a suitable clean solvent. Dry them with a clean cloth. Cleaning with water or steam is not advisable, since even a small amount of water in the assembled unit will cause the lubricant to deteriorate. Carefully examine all bearings, races, and gears for signs of wear, cracks, binding, excessive looseness, or other damage. Make sure the splines do not have excessive play and fit properly. Check the housings for cracks or excessive wear. Note that a frosted appearance of the tapered roller bearings and races indicates normal wear. The propeller shaft can be set up and checked for alignment by using a dial indicator as shown. This need only be done if there is reason to believe that the shaft is bent, as indicated by vibration while driving at high speed, or in the case of a collision job. Refer to your 1956 Buick shop manual for complete procedures and specifications. Now let's begin to assemble the unit. If inspection has shown the need for replacement of parts, only those found to be defective should be replaced. However, ring gear and pinion must always be replaced as a matched set. Build-up of the differential case will be the first step. Begin by installing the differential bearing outer races using differential bearing outer race replacer and driver handle. Make sure that no burrs or foreign matter prevent the races from bottoming in the case. Assemble the side gears, pinions, and side pinion thrust washers in the case. There are no washers used behind the side gears. Then make sure the pinions line up with side pinion shaft bore and install the side pinion shaft, positioning the side pinion shield so that the shaft enters it. Then install the spring lock pin through the pinion shaft. Using the 3 aligning studs, install the ring gear on the case and tighten the ring gear retaining bolts. Then, torque them to specifications gradually at alternate sides to prevent distorting the gear. Now let's proceed to the differential carrier. Install the front pinion bearing outer race as shown with the outer race replacer. Then, invert the carrier housing in the bench fixture and use the rear replacer to install the rear pinion bearing outer race. If a new ring and pinion gear set is to be installed, a trial depth setting must now be made. From this starting point, the shim thickness needed between pinion gear and rear bearing can be determined. These shims, which are marked, range between 40 thousandths and 70 thousandths and control the depth to which pinion gear engages ring gear. For the trial, select a nominal shim of 48 thousandths. Place this shim on the pinion gear shaft and press on the rear pinion bearing. Use the ram and yoke assembly, pinion bearing replacer, and the press plate holder as shown. Next, for a starting adjustment of pinion bearing preload, select 2 spacers whose thickness totals 435 thousandths. Spacers permit a range in adjustment of 400 to 470 thousandths, and they control the distance between the front and rear pinion bearings. With these spacers in position on the pinion shaft, place the assembly in the carrier housing and install the front pinion bearing and nut. Do not install the pinion oil seal at this time. Hold the nut with the pinion nut holder and turn the pinion shaft counterclockwise into the nut using the pinion spline socket and pinion spline socket handle as shown. If torque wrench J1313B is used, tighten the pinion nut until a reading of 80 foot-pounds shows on the torque wrench scale. This will give 250 foot-pounds at the pinion nut. Then, rotate the pinion shaft several times to make sure the bearings are seated. Now use an inch-pound torque wrench to turn the pinion shaft slowly and note the rolling torque reading. This reading indicates pinion bearing preload, which should be 10 to 30 inch-pounds. Now, if pinion bearing preload is under 10 inch-pounds, we must reduce the spacer thickness in order to increase preload. If preload is over 30 inch-pounds, we must increase the spacer thickness to decrease preload. The spacer selection chart, as shown in the Buick shop manual, indicates the added spacer thickness necessary to obtain the correct preload when preload exceeds the specified limits. For example, if pinion bearing preload is 70 inch-pounds, the intersecting lines on the chart indicate a required addition of 4 thousandths to the spacer thickness. If the correct preload is not established, early pinion bearing failure will result. With the correct preload established, check the face of the pinion gear. A marking of 0 indicates that the pinion is to be set exactly at the design or nominal distance from the center line of the ring gear. Minus or plus figures indicate amount in thousandths of an inch that the pinion gear must be moved away from or set towards the center line of the ring gear. These figures are etched on the pinion at the factory to describe the best operating relationship between pinion and ring gear. Continue the pinion depth adjustment as follows. Hold the indicator gauge at the yoke and locate the dial indicator button so that it contacts pad B of the master gauge. Then, tighten thumb screw to lock the dial indicator in position and set the dial to 0. The recommended procedure for zeroing the pinion setting gauge is to press the discs firmly against the horizontal and vertical pads on the master gauge. In this way, pressure is not applied directly to the yoke. Now, position the indicator gauge between the pedestals of the differential housing and install the adapters through the pedestal bores. If necessary, use suitable chisels to spread the pedestal clamps just enough to allow for insertion of the adapters. Then, remove the chisels. Rotate the pinion until the gauging tooth is directly under the button of the dial indicator. Then, operate the indicator gauge without applying pressure to the yoke in the same manner as when checking in the master gauge. Note the dial indicator reading. This reading must be made to correspond with the depth setting etched on the pinion gear face. To do this, add or subtract shim thickness between the pinion gear and the rear bearing. For example, if the dial indicator reads +5 and the pinion gear is marked +3, add 2 thousandths to the shim thickness. Meanwhile, to maintain the proper pinion bearing preload when changing the pinion depth shim, add to the preload spacers the same amount added during the pinion depth adjustment. On the other hand, if pinion depth shim thickness is decreased, the same amount must be subtracted from the preload spacers. The procedure for selecting proper shims and preload spacers is fully covered in the Buick shop manual. After the shim thickness has been changed to correct the pinion depth, reassemble rear bearing and the corrected preload spacers. Install front bearing, then lubricate new pinion seal with axle lubricant and install it in the housing with lip toward the bearing. Use pinion bearing oil seal installer as shown. Next, place the pinion shaft in the carrier, install and retorque pinion nut, and check pinion depth as before with the indicator gauge to determine if depth adjustment is now correct. Also, recheck the pinion bearing preload with the inch-pound scale. Preload must not exceed 40 inch-pounds, including drag of new lubricated pinion oil seal. Then, stake the pinion nut to prevent it from turning. We are now ready to install the ring gear and case assembly. Hold the differential bearings in their races and position the assembly between the bearing pedestals of the differential housing. Insert the bearing support tools through the pedestal bores until they engage the differential bearings. If necessary, install the pedestal clamp bolts and tighten just enough to allow the support tools to be moved by twisting. If support tools are too tight, loosen them by slightly wedging pedestals open with chisels. With the dial indicator clamped to the carrier flange, lightly tap or twist the support tools one way or the other to obtain a minimum backlash of 0.08 between new ring gear and pinion. Reset old gears to original backlash as previously recorded during disassembly, unless backlash was outside limits. If backlash varies more than 0.03 when checked at 3 or 4 points around the gear, measure runout of the ring gear and case, which should not exceed 0.02. With the proper backlash established, measure the clearance between each differential bearing and its pedestal with a shim. These shims are furnished to be used singly in thicknesses ranging from 40 to 82 thousandths in steps of 0.02. Then select a shim 2 thousandths thicker than the largest shim that can be inserted at each side to preload the differential bearings. Note that the support tools are left in place while measuring. Now, remove the support tool farthest from the ring gear. Insert the shim selected for that side, center the shim, and replace the support tool. Place the other shim in position for insertion and begin to spread the pedestals with differential bearing pedestal spreader. Apply only enough pressure to permit the second shim to be started at the ring gear side. Caution: excessive spreading may cause the pedestals to take a permanent set. Then remove the left support tool, center the shim, and reinstall support tool. With the pedestal spreader removed, the 2 thousandths oversized shim at each side provides preload on the differential bearings. Next, using a support tool, drive the bearing supports through the pedestal bores so that they are seated solidly in the bearings. Install and torque the pedestal clamp bolts 30 to 40 foot-pounds and secure the nuts with cotter pins. Again, recheck the ring gear and pinion backlash with the dial indicator. At the point of minimum lash, it must be 7 thousandths to 9 thousandths with no more than 3 thousandths variation at any point around the gear. On the 70 series axle, inspect and, if necessary, disassemble and clean the oil pump. Install the oil pump and line. Then invert the carrier and install the differential carrier sling. Now, remove the differential carrier assembly from the holding fixture and use a suitable support to carefully lower it into place in the axle housing. Engage holes in the carrier housing flange with the axle housing studs. Then install the nuts and tighten them gradually at alternate sides to a final torque of 50 to 60 foot-pounds. With the axle assembly in a horizontal position as shown, assemble propeller shaft, torque tube, and strut rods. Also, install brake line on rear of the axle housing and connect the torque tube brake line at the T-fitting. Now let's return to the wheel bearings. Press each axle shaft into the bearing with bearing seal toward the axle shaft flange, using the hydraulic ram and yoke assembly, press plate holder, and installer as pictured. Note that the retainer plate must be in place before bearing is installed, and that axle shafts are not interchangeable due to the oil pump splines and the greater length of the right axle shaft. Next, use the same hydraulic ram setup, installer and holder, to press the new wheel bearing retainer ring onto the shaft with chamfered side toward bearing. Make sure the retainer ring is flush against the bearing inner race. Caution: Do not attempt to install bearing and retainer ring at the same time, or damage to the press plate will result. Now install new wheel bearing gasket at the bearing shoulder in the axle housing. This gasket is designed to prevent lubricant from passing by the wheel bearing. If no leaks were evident at the wheel bearing during disassembly, and neither the brake backing plate nor axle housing was replaced, use the same number and thickness of retainer plate gaskets as were originally removed. Install the axle shafts, gaskets, and the retainer plate nuts. Tighten nuts to 65 to 70 foot-pounds torque. In exceptional cases, where this clearance adjustment of the retainer plate gaskets is required, refer to your Buick shop manual for detailed procedures and specifications. With the proper clearance, both inner and outer gaskets are compressed to prevent grease leaks and side movement of the axle shaft and bearing. To complete assembly, install brake drums and wheels. Then, fill rear axle assembly with factory hypoid lubricant only. This is very important, as damage to the gears will result if substitute lubricants are used. Note, 6 pints are required to completely fill the new rear axle to the correct level. Remove the assembly from the stands and roll it into position under the car. Next, engage the torque tube and propeller shaft to the torque ball flange, using the 2 guide pins for proper alignment. Roll the axle assembly slowly forward until the propeller shaft splines engage the universal joint yoke and the torque tube and ball flanges meet. Then, install and tighten the 4 flange bolts. Connect the rear springs and brake lines and loosely assemble shock absorbers and the radius rod. Then, raise the rear axle assembly so that it supports the normal car weight. Complete installation by torquing shock absorber connections, radius rod nut, and torque ball retainer bolts. Then, bleed brakes. As a final check, thoroughly road test the rear axle. Begin slowly and drive in several speed ranges. Make sure that you have obtained the quiet, smooth operation that is built into this new Buick rear axle. In conclusion, caution the owner to operate the car in the same manner as recommended for a new car to allow the gears to run in smoothly.